Page 374. This painting depicts the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears. Analyzing sources. What does this image suggest about the Native Americans' experience on the Trail of Tears? Use details from the painting to explain your answer. President Jackson, who supported Georgia's efforts to remove the Cherokee, declared that he would ignore the Supreme Court's ruling. John Marshall has made his decision, Jackson is said to have declared. Now let him enforce it. No one was willing or able to challenge the president's failure to enforce the court's ruling. The Trail of Tears. By 1835, the Cherokee were divided about what to do. That year, the federal government convinced a small number of Cherokee, about 500 of them, to sign the Treaty of New Echota. In this treaty, the group agreed to give up all Cherokee land by 1838. Cherokee Chief John Ross sent a protest to the U.S. Senate. Ross explained that the few Cherokee who signed the treaty did not speak for all the 17,000 Cherokee in the region. Many white Americans, including Senators Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, also opposed the treaty as unfair. However, their pleas did not change the minds of President Jackson or the white settlers. In 1836, the Senate approved the treaty by a single vote. When the treaty's 1838 deadline arrived, only about 2,000 Cherokee had moved west. Jackson's successor, President Martin Van Buren, ordered the army to move the rest of them. In May 1838, General Winfield Scott arrived in the Cherokee Nation with 7,000 troops to remove the remaining Cherokee by force. He told them that resistance and escape were hopeless. My troops already occupy many positions in the country that you are to abandon, and thousands are approaching them every quarter. Obey them when they tell you that you can remain no longer in this country. Chiefs, headmen, and warriors, will you then, by resistance, compel us to resort to arms? George Winfield Scott, Proclamation, 1838. The Cherokee knew that fighting would lead to their destruction. Filled with sadness and anger, Cherokee leaders gave in. Between June and December 1838, soldiers rounded up Cherokee in North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee. Under guard, the Cherokee began their march to Indian Territory in the west. The forced relocation of some 15,000 Cherokee was a terrible ordeal. Most people were not prepared for the journey. Trouble started even before they set out, as the Cherokee crowded in camps and awaited the command to begin their march. Illness broke out. As many as 2,000 Cherokee died. Once on the trail, they suffered from hunger and from exposure to the weather. These conditions led to the deaths of another 2,000 people. When the relocation was over, about 1/4 of the Cherokee population was dead. The Cherokee came to call their forced journey west the trail where they cried. Historians call it the Trail of Tears. Checking for understanding. Number 1. Explaining issues. What was the purpose of the Indian Removal Act? Number 2. Identifying causes. Why did Chief John Ross send a letter to the Senate after the U.S. government convinced 500 Cherokee to sign the Treaty of New Echota? Making connections across cultures. Cultural assimilation. From early in its history, the U.S. government developed many policies to civilize indigenous people. One such policy was to force Native American children to leave their families and reservations and attend boarding schools, where they were taught European values and subject matter. Children were required to speak English and were banned from speaking their native languages. Also banned were shamans, feast rituals, funeral practices, and other important cultural rites. It was not until 1978, when the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed, that Native Americans could freely practice all their religious traditions. Today, Native American communities still struggle with the loss of so much of their traditions and languages. Native American removal. After passage of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the government began to force the 5 civilized tribes living east of the Mississippi River to move to an area that was located in what is now part of the state of Oklahoma. Number 1, analyzing. About how many Native Americans had to move to Indian Territory between 1830 and 1840? Number 2, inferring. Which Native American groups in the South had the largest population in the early 1800s? How can you tell? This is a bar graph. Look at the title. The title tells us it's about forced migration between 1830 and 1840. Here we see the 5 tribes: the Choctaw, the Creek, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Seminole. The bar graph shows you have 0, 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000. This represents the number of people. So the Seminole was less than 5,000. The Cherokee was more than 15,000. Chickasaw was close to 5,000. The Creek was more than 10,000 but less than 15,000. The Choctaw were less than 5,000. So you can see which tribes were forced to leave in greater numbers.